Before the world knew the names of the powerful, before the city was mapped by invisible lines of influence, and before the law had found its footing, there was a time of long shadows. It was a time when the streets spoke in whispers, and power didn't carry a title or a badge. It was the era before the Great Change, a period of 20 years where the map of America was being drawn by hand, day by day, in the dust of the docks and the soot of the tenement halls. If you were to walk through a city in 1905, you would not see the structured empires of the silver screen. You would see a world that was still becoming itself, a place where order was not something granted by the state, but something negotiated in the quiet corners of a neighborhood market. This is the story of that quiet time, the 2 decades before the roar of the 20s, when the power that ruled the streets had no name. Imagine, if you will, the city at dusk in the first decade of the 20th century. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the salty tang of the harbor. The sounds are different then. There is the rhythmic clatter of iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, the distant chime of a trolley bell, and the low hum of thousands of voices speaking in a dozen different tongues. There are no neon signs to pierce the dark, only the flickering orange glow of gas lamps that cast long, swaying shadows against the brickwork. In this light, the city feels vast and porous. It is growing faster than the mind can grasp. Every day, ships exhale hundreds of new souls onto the piers, and every day, the brick canyons grow a little deeper. In this rapid expansion, there is a space, a gap, between the old laws and the new reality. And it was in this gap that a silent system began to breathe. At this time, there were no families, as we understand them now. There were no bosses of bosses, no national commissions, and no sprawling hierarchies that stretched across state lines. Instead, there was the block. The neighborhood was the universe. If you lived on a certain street, your world was defined by the 3 blocks in either direction. The level for the block was the same rhythm that felt permanent. You knew the man who sold the coal, the woman who baked the bread, and the men who stood on the corner, watching the world go away. These men did not wear uniforms, and they did not carry themselves with the theatrical flair of the decades to follow. They were often just part of the landscape, as much a fixture of the street as the fire hydrants or the stoops. These were the nameless collectives, groups of men bound together not by a formal oath, but by the shared experience of the pavement. They were products of the environment, a response to a world where the official systems of protection and justice often failed to reach the immigrant doorstep. In the crowded tenements, where 3 families might share a single floor, the concept of privacy was a luxury few could afford. Life was lived in the open, and the symbol of petrified, and the bustling courtyards. Life was lived in the open. Because of this, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. A man's word, his presence, and his ability to navigate the unspoken rules of the block were what gave him power. It was a localized, fragmented authority. A man might be a king on 4th Street and a complete stranger on 6th. This lack of structure meant that there was no central piece, but rather 1,000 tiny, separate pieces. Each neighborhood functioned like a small city-state, governed by quiet understandings. There was no need for a grand manifesto when a simple nod or a lingering gaze could communicate everything necessary. The influence these groups held was subtle, woven into the fabric of daily commerce. They were the ones who ensured that a pushcart stayed in its place, that a shipment of ice arrived on time, or that a dispute between neighbors was settled without the intervention of a police force that often felt like an occupying army from another world. It was a system of shadow governance, a way of managing the chaos of a city that was bursting at the seams. Think of the docks in 1912. The waterfront was the heartbeat of the nation, a chaotic tangle of masts, steam pipes, and sweating laborers. It was a place where millions of tons of goods moved every year, and yet, It was a place of profound informality. There were no digital logs or steel containers. Everything was moved by hand, by hook, and by sheer will. In this environment, the men who controlled the flow of labor held a power that was absolute yet invisible. They didn't need a corporate title. They simply stood at the gates. They decided who worked and who went hungry. They took a small portion of the wages, not as a grand theft, but as a fee for the order they provided. To the outside observer, it looked like a mess of shouting men and swaying crates. To those inside, it was a clockwork mechanism of unspoken obligations. There was a certain routine to this era of crime that made it almost indistinguishable from honest toil. The men who ran these early gangs often held day jobs. They were draymen, longshoremen, or saloon keepers. Their influence was an extension of their presence in the community. They were the ones people went to when a son needed a job or when a landlord was being unfair. By solving these small, human problems, they built a reservoir of debt and loyalty that could be called upon when needed. It wasn't about the spectacular heist or the high-speed chase. It was about the slow accumulation of influence. It was the power of being the man who knew everyone, and who everyone owed a small favor. In these years, the law was a distant and often inconsistent thing. The police departments of the early 1900s were often just as fragmented as the gangs they sought to monitor. Officers were tied to their precinct, their loyalties often lying with the local political machine rather than a central headquarters. This created a landscape of grey zones, places where the written law in 2016, the law was restricted into the same reign of candidate Dyson and Hunter's efforts. In these zones, the nameless gangs flourished. They didn't seek to overthrow the law, they sought to coexist with it, to find the points where the gears of the city didn't quite mesh, and to slip their fingers into the machinery. It was a delicate balance, a dance of shadows where everyone knew their place, even if that place was never written down. The physical environment of the pre-Prohibition city played a vital role in this quiet power. The cities were mazes of narrow alleys, interconnected basements, and rooftop passages. A man who knew the geography of his neighborhood could vanish in seconds, melting into the brick and mortar. This gave the early gangs a sense of omnipresence. They didn't need to be everywhere. They just needed to feel like they could be anywhere. The invisible boundaries were real to those who lived there. You knew when you had crossed from one influence zone into another. The air felt different. The faces on the stoops changed. The unwritten rules shifted just enough to make you feel like a guest or a ghost. The pace of life was slower then, and so was the pace of the underworld. Influence was built over decades, not months. A young man would start by running errands, learning the faces and the names, understanding who was respected and why. There was a patience to it. The city was still being built, the subway tunnels were still being dug, and the bridges were still being suspended over the rivers. There was a sense that there was enough for everyone if you just knew how to wait and where to stand. The tension was not the sharp, jagged fear of a modern era, but a low, vibrating hum, the sound of millions of people trying to find their way in a new world. As we move through the years toward 1919, we see the first signs of the fog beginning to lift. The world was changing. The Great War had brought a new sense of national identity and a new scale to everything. The local fragmented world of the neighborhood was beginning to feel small. The government was becoming more centralized, and the technology of the city was evolving. Automobiles were replacing horses, making the invisible boundaries of the block harder to maintain. The world was shrinking, and the nameless power of the early gangs was starting to feel the pressure of a changing society. But before that transition was complete, there was a final, quiet moment, a moment where the old ways still held. You can almost feel it, the stillness of a Sunday morning in a 1915 tenement district. The churches are full, the markets are closed, and for a few hours, the city breathes in a slow, steady rhythm. In this stillness, the system is at its most visible. You see the respect paid to certain elders, the way the crowd parts for a particular man walking down the sidewalk, the way a problem is settled with a few quiet words on a street corner. This was the peak of the nameless era. A time of organic, neighborhood-grown order that required no titles and no grand architecture. It was an unstable period, though we may not have seen it at the time. It was a city still deciding what it would become. The lack of a single central control meant that there was always a sense of unfinished business. The fog of the early century provided cover, but it also created a sense of wandering. No one group was in control of the whole, and so the city was a patchwork quilt of competing interests. It was a beautiful, chaotic, and sometimes heady landscape. It was a time of shadows, where the truth of who held power was often found not in the light of the town square, but in the dim corridors of the human heart and the shared memory of the neighborhood. As the year 1919 approached, a shadow of a different kind began to fall over the country. The movement for temperance was growing, and a new law was on the horizon, one that would change the chemistry of the streets forever. Prohibition would eventually provide the catalyst that turned these local, nameless groups into the structured organizations of history books. It would provide the one thing they didn't have, a common national commodity that required a national network. It would force the shadows to organize, to find names, to build hierarchies, and to step out of the neighborhood and onto the national stage. But that is a story for another night. For now, we stay in the quiet. We stay in the time when a man's influence was measured by the length of his shadow in the gaslight. We stay in the streets that answer to no one but themselves. We remember the docks where the only law was the word of the man at the gate, and the tenements where justice was something discussed over a kitchen table in a language the authorities couldn't understand. There is a certain peace in remembering this era. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of names and dates, but a collection of systems and environments. It reminds us that power often moves in silence, and that the things that shape our world are often the things we never think to name. The gangs of the early 1900s were not the mob. They were the city itself, restless, growing, and finding its own way through the dark. They were the human element in a machine that was growing too large for anyone to truly control. The gas lamps are flickering out now, being replaced by the steady, cold hum of electric light. The horses are being led to their stables, and the city is settling into the deep, heavy sleep of the early morning. The unwritten rules are still there, held in the minds of the men who walk the late watch. The invisible boundaries still hold, for a little while longer. The world is on the brink of a great noise, but for this moment, there is only the sound of the wind moving through the brick canyons and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the tide against the piers. The nameless era was a time of transition, a bridge between the old world and the new. It was a time when the power of the street was as natural and as complicated as the people who lived there. It was a period of quiet tension, of unspoken understandings, and of a society that was still learning how to live with itself. It was a time that mattered because it set the stage for everything that followed, providing the roots for the trees that would eventually cast much longer and darker shadows. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those streets. See the long, empty stretches of cobblestone. Feel the cool dampness of the night air. Listen to the silence of a city that has not yet found its voice, but has already found its rhythm. It is a world that has been forgotten by the history books, which prefer the loud and the famous, but it is a world that still exists in the foundations of the buildings and the layout of the alleys. History remembers the names, the bosses, and the headlines, but the systems, the environments, and the quiet power of the nameless, those are the things that truly built the world. Before the structure, there was the spirit. Before the hierarchy, there was the habit. And before the mob had bosses, there were only the streets, waiting, in the long and silent shadows, to be claimed.